BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. And today I'm really thrilled to welcome a bit of a star, an author of a stunning and provocative and really wide-ranging book, and of a topic, speaking on a topic that is at once historical and terribly political. It is the end of the Enlightenment, and the author, Richard Whatmore, is with me. Richard, hello.
Hello, Philip. It's a pleasure to be here.
Listen, Richard, this is such a provocative and thought-provoking book. I have written a little bit about the Enlightenment. I have written a bit about the end of Enlightenment, but what you mean is something completely different. And at the same time, you lead us back into history. And at the same time, it totally sounds as if you're talking about today. And, well, parallels in history are always misleading, but they're also fascinating. And you are making some very obvious ones. And let me just read a little bit from the beginning of the book, because what century are you talking about? You're talking about a merchant elite, and you say they were so influential in politics that they could be portrayed as having propelled Britain onto a path that saw the national debt expand exponentially, wars being fought for commercial dominion across the globe, and British society ever more divided between those whose lives depended on the mercantile system and those who were its victims. The sense of crisis was acute. Few observers of political affairs were optimistic about the future. Well, that sounds about as topical in 2024 as it did sometime at the end of the 18th century, because the point you are making, and the point that many people have found so thought-provoking, is that the end of the Enlightenment didn't come sometime after 1945 and after Auschwitz. It didn't come with the commercialization of the world or with social media. No, you say it came right in the middle of the 18th century, when people believed, leading Enlightenment figures believed, that the Enlightenment had gone too far, that it had gone astray, that it had destroyed and eaten its own children.
That's right. And I actually think the direct parallel with the present does work to a greater extent than the parallels that we sometimes draw today with the post-World War I or even post-World War II eras. And the reason is, at the end of Enlightenment, the philosophers that I'm interested in, obviously some of them we call them philosophers, but some of them see themselves as political activists. That's obviously a word of the present, not of their time. But they felt that all the existing ideologies that they might draw upon to solve their problems had failed. So I think the big difference with the interwar, post-World War I and interwar period and post-war period too, is that there was still an option, an ideological option in the form of socialism or communism that people appealed to solve all their problems.
But isn't that our situation today as well? That we are finding that we're living in a world where we've exhausted our ideological options?
Exactly. That's why I think the parallel is with the end of Enlightenment, with the end of the 18th century. So that's the parallel. So I think lots of commentators say, oh, we're reliving the 1930s. I don't think we are, because we don't have the option of Soviet communism, which attracted so many people, and we don't have a clear sense of liberalism. I know liberalism is on the back foot in the 1930s, especially, and some people think it's died in the 1930s. But there are ideological options. You know, people still have faith in ideology, whereas I suppose the parallel with the end of the Enlightenment era is that people think everything that they believed in has to adjust to a completely altered world. So everybody thinks what exists can't last. So therefore, politics and political speculation becomes about alternative futures. So you have to focus on the alternative futures and how to get there, because they're very practical. They don't just believe that you can say, oh, well, in a future alternative world, everything would be a lot better. You've got to explain how you get from the present hell to your improved future. So they're obsessed with transition mechanisms, which is something that, often in our politics, sometimes they're not that practical, whereas their politics are very, very practical, but they're also very, very depressed. And that's another clear parallel with the present. So actually, I think in some ways, coming back to the quote that you read, in some ways, the problem has always been the mercantile system.
But that's really interesting, and I want us to go slowly, not to jump too many hurdles at once. At the time of the French Revolution, it's clear that a lot of people were disillusioned with the Enlightenment because they saw that the embodiment of all their ideals had turned into a bloody terror, that it was killing people, that all of their ideals were betrayed. But the real crisis of the Enlightenment that you write about and pinpoint is before. It's 20 years before and concerns people like David Hume, one of the seminal geniuses of the Enlightenment. And his problem is that the Enlightenment ideas have been too successful, that individual liberties, that a liberalization of society and of trade have created a monster. Can you tell us about this monster?
Certainly. So Hume genuinely believes in Enlightenment, and he thinks that Enlightenment means the end of wars of religion. That what Enlightenment meant to contemporaries is any strategy that prevents wars of religion from breaking out. Now, obviously, one of the ways of preventing people from turning fanatic and deciding to kill one another for religious reasons would be social control. So controlling people to the nth degree in every part of their lives is a strategy for enlightenment, because you can use the state or political structures to prevent people from turning fanatic. And Hume thought that the contemporary age had managed to develop strategies, but they were also compatible with the existence of free states, because Hume, being a lover of liberty, was a supporter of free states. He doesn't think everywhere can be a free state, and he doesn't want to universalize them, and he doesn't want to invade places to make them free. But he thinks that Enlightenment exists. And the example that he always gave was Louis XIV. Louis XIV is always presented by people like Hume as somebody who wanted to restart the Counter-Reformation, with his war on Protestants and kicking the Huguenots out of France and waging war, especially on Protestant states. So it looks as if Louis XIV might end the Enlightenment. And Hume thinks the defeat of Louis XIV by, free states like the Dutch and the English, obviously becomes British after the Union of 1707, then he thinks there's genuine Enlightenment. And in the 1740s, 1750s, he's optimistic. He thinks, as he says it, you can have civilized monarchies. And civilized monarchies are where you have governments of laws rather than men. That's your aspiration. Means that you don't have to have a completely free state. You just have to have laws that entrench your liberty. And he thinks that Britain and France are going to become more and more alike. So he's very happy about that because he loves France. He thinks it's much more civilized than anywhere else. The culture is better than anywhere else.
He lived in Paris for a while.
He did. He has a government post, and he loved it. He loved it. He's venerated, which he also likes, but he thinks he feels at home philosophically, and he hates xenophobia, hates politicians fomenting bigotry He thinks all of that is dreadful. And so he genuinely believes in enlightenment. And then, ironically, after the 7 Years' War, so in the 1760s, after the British have won the 7 Years' War, he thinks that fanaticism is secularized, and that rather than there being theological sources of fanaticism, you're finding them in everyday politics. And he associates with the growth of fanaticism with the selfishness of politicians, the growth of public credit, and the addiction to war and empire, especially by the British, which he thinks will potentially ruin the state.
This addiction is really interesting, to just butt in there, because I've written a book which is going to come out in English quite soon, and I've also done a podcast about it for those people who've watched it, where I've asked the question, why was it Europe that became so successful in the world? And as you know, there are many historians who say what made Europe unique was not Christianity, was not a cultural idea. It was an accident of geography. That meant that there were so many in this basically decaying Roman Empire, or decayed Roman Empire. There were so many small princes living next to each other, and in a situation of competition, technological competition for better armies, etc., that technology had much more, and other branches of knowledge had much more need to be developed in Europe than they had in more stable and frankly more civilized empires, such as China or the Ottoman Empire. That meant that you had lots of states jockeying for position, jockeying for power, and states developing bigger armies, bigger navies. And of course, Europe also has the open sea, which made it predisposed for colonial empire. But here we come at the moment in the 18th century when this becomes almost cancerous, when the power of the states becomes such that they have to compete ever more intensely, and when they develop what people then call the mercantile empires, and they look terribly modern somehow.
Yes. I mean, in some ways, they've never gone away. You know, Hume says that the world changed to the point that ancient philosophies were no longer relevant when commerce becomes a reason of state, in his famous phrase. And what he means...
When commerce becomes a reason of state.
Yes. So states want to pursue the markets of their rivals. And he thinks it occurs in the second half of the 17th century. He thinks the final decades. And he thinks that states such as England, France, more than anywhere else, but also in the Dutch Republic, there's a turn to empire, because you no longer want the little states or even big states that are around you to thrive. You want their markets, and you can control them by means of controlling their economies rather than necessarily their politics. And, you know, this, in a sense, one of the great changes in the world is that there are no more small states, because all of the survival strategies employed by the small states, they don't work anymore. You know, you can't rely on the manliness of your patriotic militia. They're not going to be able to maintain you. I mean, I know that some people say, oh, well, there's been lots of examples of militia defeating big powers, but they only defeat big powers when they've got another big power supporting them. So the American Revolution would never have been a success if France, you know, an autocratic state, had not funded the revolutionaries. That's what Thomas Paine said.
Which, fascinatingly enough, leads directly to the French Revolution, because the French state bankrupts itself in the process.
Exactly. So it's the case that this turn to empire that's sometimes associated with the 19th century, but actually it's an 18th century phenomenon. The small states, if you look at the republics of Europe, if you look at Poland, Lithuania as a larger commonwealth, but also the individual republics, Venice, Genoa, Swiss Confederation, Dutch Republic, they all disappear. The only republic that survives is San Marino into the 19th century. Obviously, it's an irrelevant Italian rock. That's why it survives. Everywhere else that has a decent market ceases to exist. But the very interesting thing is that free states, all of these are so-called free states, they all disappear. So republicanism as an ideology, which is sometimes emphasized as being very important in the 18th century, especially if you look at the American Revolution and the French Revolution, it too is in decline and likely potentially to die out. So are the free states. And that's why Britain is so odd. It really is odd. And in a sense, the focus on Britain is a key part of the end of Enlightenment, not because the British are better than anywhere else. The argument of contemporaries is that they're a lot worse, but they ought to have died out the same way as the Dutch Republic, declines, because commercial empires historically have always been defeated. Carthage's have always been defeated by Rome's, and that doesn't happen in the British case, or at least doesn't happen until, 1945 and its own bankruptcy.
But that doesn't happen because Britain understands something very important or about a new era of power. And it understands that states rest on markets, and that the worst that can happen to a state is not that its population is miserable, but that it runs out of money.
Exactly, or goes bankrupt. As you've already said, the French do. And maintaining public credit. Obviously, there's a relationship between public credit and having some kind of a free state, which allows the British to mortgage their future, to invest in the most expensive armaments, to get the best ships, to employ their own sailors and also mercenary sailors from everywhere, and to defeat their rivals. But actually, I think what's very significant about the end of Enlightenment era, end of the 18th century, is that the British start subsidizing the autocracies. So Russia, Prussia, Holy Roman Empire, they're all funded.
They want stable markets.
They are employed. Their soldiers fight for the British. And the interesting thing is that, a century before, the joke about the last English Stuart kings was that Louis XIV secretly gave them pensions as long as they followed the French line in foreign policy. So to have a free state subsidizing the autocracies, it's a complete transformation of politics. And I think that's very significant. And it is because of the British, either you could say the power of the free economy, or you can say it's the mercantile system in action.
It is also, of course, it is colonialism and slavery. I mean, Britain's wealth rests to a great degree on the triangular trade, on the Caribbean production of sugar and other luxury commodities. And if Britain is rich enough to have a vast army that spans the entire globe, that is unthinkable without this branch of its economy.
Yes, I mean, it's exactly the same as pretty much every historic empire in that respect, although it's the link with liberty that I think is I mean, obviously you could say that's the grotesque part, that a free state rests on a corrupt economy, but then that's the interesting thing about the period that we've been talking about to before the French Revolution, is that all of the commentators think Britain is going to collapse because you can't have a free society, you can't have a free country and a mercantile system.
But then there's sort of voices like the pesky Mr. Mandeville, who says it's because of the corruption, because of the vices, that the state can be free and the society can be wealthy. Because as long as everybody is interested in luxury, the markets go well. And if people become virtuous and live austere lives, then the markets will collapse and the wealth of the state will collapse and slavery will ensue.
Yes, although Mandeville really doesn't imagine Britain's future as a kind of gargantuan empire that's accused of becoming a universal commercial monarchy, equivalent to the universal monarchies, obviously in Mandeville's time associated with Louis XIV, invading countries and incorporating them into an empire. The idea of a mercantile empire where you don't necessarily control the politics of the states that you actually are running because you're in control of the economy, so the politics, domestic politics, can run their own way. The people can even believe that they're free, and they can have free governments, but actually who controls the economy is the question, and it's the imperial power that will put pressure on politicians and potentially replace them whenever they do something that's against the metropole, and obviously that's normal to us, but that's shocking to the 18th century mind.
But again, it's amazing that you're talking about the 18th century there, not about the 21st in so many ways. But so Hume's argument is basically that through the commercialization of a state, it loses its moral core. A society that only becomes reliant on trade loses something important. Is that this sounds a very conservative argument, and there's a lot of conservative. I always think it's interesting to listen to good conservative voices because they often have a very strong critique. And you also mention Burke, for instance, who and they have a very strong critique of the Enlightenment, of the shadows of the Enlightenment that Enlightenment thinkers often don't want to see. But so. What is the disquiet of people like Hume in this new world with this new commercialized empire?
Well, I mean, Hume justifies commercial society. He thinks that there are forms of commerce that bring people together. He doesn't think it's ever a force for peace, except in a utopian sense, because it's clear that states, the jealousy of trade exists, obviously, as he says in one of his famous essays. It can be found everywhere. But it's also the case that if he defends commercial society, he and great friends of his like Adam Smith, they associate commerce with chaos. And the chaos that you have through commerce...
Adam Smith
as well. So you've got to remember that they're Scots. So they're living in a society where you've had the Union of 1707, and they're both supporters of the Union, and they think that commerce will cause a social transformation of Scotland by getting rid of the feudal aristocracy, and you'll have urbanization, and you'll have the growth of politeness, and they see that, especially in Edinburgh, the development of the new town in Edinburgh, that they, their memorials, their graves are both in Edinburgh, and they live through a time of the rapid transformation of Scotland, and Scotland's a success story, so they're not complaining about commercial society per se, and they think the extraordinary thing about commercial society is it makes the rich poor and it makes the poor rich, and it's a perpetual motion. That's what you get with commerce. Commerce is chaos, but it's also a chaos internationally. So rich countries can become poor and poor countries can become rich very rapidly, but they see the mercantile system, which is a certain kind of commercial society projected through state power internationally and associated with the growth of empire. That's the dangerous part, and it's fanatic. It's fanatic because merchants and bankers are bribing politicians to pass legislation for their own profit rather than for the public good. And they think of it, they see it, they think it's the reason for the American Revolution. And they see it in contemporary Bengal, especially, and they blame Warren Hastings and Clive before him. And they think that because America has been lost to the British, obviously the 13 colonies, They think India might go the same way. That's Edmund Burke's view, as you know, with his impeachment of Warren Hastings. These are assaults on the mercantile system. The assumption being that if you have an economy that is so addicted to the pursuit of commercial empire, it will cause the collapse of this empire, because you can't run other parts of the globe in this way. Your domestic politics will be corrupted, and you will no longer be able to fight wars. And in a sense, this whole period is one that shows mercantile systems are actually perfectly compatible with the fighting of wars and success in war. It's just that the British don't do so well in the case of the United States. But the reason for that is because the French decide we're going to fight the British, and so does Spain, and so does the Dutch Republic. We're going to support the American revolutionaries, which is a fact about the success of the American Revolution, as I mentioned before.
You make the point very strongly that the Enlightenment is a response to the religious wars and to the fanaticism of killing people for having a different view about Christ and all his attributes, and different view about points of theology. Could one say that with the fanaticism of trade, they see that the same thing comes back, that the absence of toleration, the absence of learning to live together through negotiation and through institutions and processes, that all those things break down again, and now it's no longer in the name of religion, but now it's in the name of trade or of waging war?
Certainly, it's the case that if you believe that your trade has to succeed, and it doesn't matter what you do, whether it's enslavement, whether it's the subjection of economies that you claim you're not dominating, but actually you are controlling their politics. So direct or indirect empire building, commercial empire building. There's no question that the claim of contemporaries, people like Hume, was that if you see the pursuit of the jealousy of trade to be the main goal of the state, then the policies that are pursued are likely to be amoral. There's another source of fanaticism, though, because they worry, Hume and Smith, about the fanaticism for liberty, especially in Britain, becoming republican. And they think that to create a republic is to create a church. And so they think that making everybody have the same opinions, making everybody have the same ideology, conformity, lack of toleration, is associated with the Republican story. Obviously, the Republican story was significant in England. So from a Scottish perspective, one of the worries is not so much that the Scotch are going to turn themselves into a republic. It's actually that the English might go Republican again, and then Scotland collapses because the Union fails, because the Westminster politicians have become fanatic. And so there's two forms of fanaticism, really. One directly through the pursuit of commercial empire, but also through the worry that the fanaticism of liberty, if carried to the nth degree, creates republican churches that are themselves entirely intolerant. And our word would be they fight culture wars to make sure that everybody conforms to the views of the leader of the republic.
I only can say I have no idea what you're talking about. That doesn't
Yes.
sound like the present at all.
No, it doesn't.
Who would know anything about sectarian politics today? But
yes.
You write a pretty earth-shattering sentence here, which is again has very strong, I think, implications for today. Well, it's two sentences. I give you the one before as well. Britain described itself as a free state whose populace enjoyed far greater liberties and rights than those of other European nations. But this free state amounted to a war machine that used individual liberty as the rationale for the destruction of other states and the subjugation of their peoples. So freedom is only possible, is only predicated ever on the subjugation of others?
The thing is that the end of the 18th century sees a liberty war. You know, the competitor free state, the Republican alternative of France, rises, and what happens? You know, there's a war to the death against the British, and the British notion of liberty battles with the French notion of liberty. And Burke's also interesting, I think, and it's coming back to what you said, Philip, about conservatism, because the interesting thing about Burke, the end of Burke's life, he dies profoundly depressed, like most of my cast. But the thing that he says is that there's no point conserving anything anymore. That's in his final letters on a regicide piece. There are 4 of them, 4 letters. And he says that you just have to prevent the French Revolution from ruining civilization. And even if the British go bankrupt, even if they end up emptying their treasuries to pay the Russians, the Prussians, and the Austrians to fight to the death against the French, even if it causes the destruction of Britain, it's worth it. It's worth it. So this sense of a liberty war, Burke would justify anything in such circumstances. And I think the politics of necessity, crisis politics, when you live in a free state that perceives itself to be in acute crisis, then the politics of the free state, then it's not going to be moderate. Because the thing is, and in some ways, the British, if they draw something from the French Revolution, it's the power of the Republican patriotism of the French. Because actually, even though the British think they defeat, the French revolutionaries and the revolution dies with Bonaparte and there's a victory, actually the Britain that emerges, it's got a lot of French Republican patriotism in the form of, anti-French xenophobia, British superiority, Britain's the only free state. Everything the British do is justified by the liberty that it promotes. And it's as if, that kind of Republican church character, which the British are so frightened of, it characterizes the free polity of Britain in the early 19th century, which is why so many people who lived through this period think the worst possible thing has happened to the world. Britain has become a model free state. It's a disaster. There must be a Republican alternative. If only we could refight the French Revolution, have another revolution that worked. And obviously that is the history of the 19th century. Socialism, always anti-British. Communism, Marx, even though the British allow him to live in Britain, hates Britain as a model, thinks, revolution ought to occur there because it's the most advanced form of capitalist development. It's where you initially would expect revolution to occur. And there must be an alternative to the British. And that's a very 18th century notion, because people are so depressed that this model free state is so good at empire and war. That is the tragic fact about it. And in some ways, pretty much all the successful free states ever since have been exactly the same, especially when they're in crisis times.
Now, it so happens that I got something in the mail today that makes me want you to ask something, because as I read it from your book, most of the British Enlighteners that you talk about see that the mercantile state is basically sick because of an excess of enlightenment. What I got in the mail was this, and I'll show it to you. You'll know it. I picked it up for very little at auction, and I'm of course insanely proud of it. You know it very well. Histoire de deux Indes by Abbé Raynal. A book that, it's actually 4 volumes of this, is probably the first large and coherent critique of colonialism and unfair globalized trade that we have. It's attributed to Raynal, but Diderot, his friend, wrote some 700 pages into it anonymously. And what their point is that this whole colonial injustice, this murderous injustice, this invasion of other countries, is not an excess of enlightenment, but a shortfall of it. These states that do that have not understood what enlightened ideas, or they don't care. They are using a deeply hypocritical religious justification. They are harking back in their arguments to justify their power. So how do these two constructions live with each other?
Yes, I mean, I think that Diderot comes to the conclusion that, like most of my cast, that mercantile systems destroy themselves. And that ultimately means Europe's doomed. You know, that as soon as the European states become more commercial, they fight each other across the globe in their attempt to expand their markets. They want to take over other polities. And, you know, Diderot, after he writes, you know, what his final works, you know, the life of Seneca, the Vie de Sénèque, he says, get away to America, go to the New World. The old world's dead. And there's exactly as you said, you know, there's no toleration. Enlightenment's gone. These are dreadful, dreadful commercial states. Diderot, again, one thing he has in common with Rousseau, he hates Britain. And he thinks the Americans have a chance, you know, of doing things differently. And so that's the solution. But I do think Raynal and Diderot and actually Smith and Hume, who both would have been very positive about Raynal's work, lots and lots of contemporaries are.
They also knew each other.
Yes, absolutely. Raynal is very well known. He's part of the circles that Hume and Smith move in. He's also associated with Turgot and this. There's a figure that I talk about, a very short-lived prime minister who ends the war in America, called Shelburne. He's called William Petty, and Raynal. He's very interested in Raynal's work, and he thinks, like so many people did, the rational thing for the British to do is become a small state again, abandon empire. You know, follow the loss in America leave India. Become a commercial polity, much better to be a smaller state. Don't have these silly wars against the French. Sooner or later, you're going to be defeated. And that's the only way you'll avoid going the way of the Dutch. And of course, by the 1780s, the Dutch are in crisis, the popular revolt. Again, the Dutch experience looks like it's the logical endpoint of the mercantile system. You know, the Dutch too have suffered from it. They're losing their empire. And it's going to be taken by the other powers. So the British are going to go the same way. The shock for Raynal, the reason that if Raynal had lived and Diderot had lived, or Smith and Hume, all of these figures, the shocking thing is that mercantile systems allow you to fight wars over decades and maintain your state. And that it would also claim that it's a free state. They would have been so shocked at the subsequent history of Britain. Obviously, there's a counter-argument that Britain goes through a new enlightenment in the 19th century. It fights its mercantile system, gets rid of the worst aspects of the empire. Obviously, abolitionism is part of the association, the claims that there's a kind of a British enlightenment in the 19th century, but that's the generation after the one that I'm writing about in this book.
Now, I mean, it's really difficult to withstand the temptation to take a few of these things in today's politics. But before we even try to do that, you make the point of the end of Enlightenment because its protagonists see it's going astray. My question about the possible end of enlightenment or capturing of the enlightenment, which leads us more into a present situation, is actually theology. Because it seems to me that so many ideas that the enlighteners thought to be originally theirs were deeply rooted in theology and were really just a relabeling of theological ideas. For instance, the idea of progress, so dear to our Enlightenment friends, has a lot to do with the Christian salvation story, with the idea that history has a direction, has a goal, and that we are on the road towards this goal. It's not something that you would have seen in any way in the middle of the 18th century or the 17th century when people were writing that. The idea of a rational person, of reason being the highest part of us, has a lot to do with the Christian soul. The fact that we want that the Enlighteners were looking for scientific dominion over nature goes right back to subjugate the earth, which God tells Adam and Eve. So it seems to me that that is important in the work that I'm doing on the Enlightenment. It seems to me that there's so much theology, very thinly veiled theology, in Enlightenment thinking, which means in turn that we today who are using those Enlightenment ideas are no longer realizing that we're actually exchanging theological arguments. Can you find any interest in this argument?
Yes, I think that that's one of the reasons why I really want to redefine enlightenment into multiple strategies for toleration. And the strategies, making people reasonable, rational, controlling the passions, unleashing the passions.
Jeremy Bentham.
Well, there's not really much that's new in the 18th century, and I have a problem, with the association of the Enlightenment, even with progress, because, most of the advocates of progress, they're projecting a future. So, Condorcet or Turgot, for example, it's the next stage of human history that's going to be the good part, where you really see progress. So that means that their notion of progress is identifying hell in the present. So actually they're as pessimistic as anybody else about the circumstances in which they found themselves. So I would accept that a lot of the things that scholars have associated with the Enlightenment is straightforwardly Christian apologetic, and it's as old as the hills. So whereas I think what's new are the strategies for maintaining toleration in the conditions of a commercial society, which some people want, they want to turn their backs on commerce because they're worried about the effects, focus on, the rural, fight the growth of towns, make sure that you have, again, the physiocratic large farms, and limit commerce so it's natural. And Britain being called an unnatural state because it has the mercantile system is an unnatural outgrowth of the kinds of jealousy of trade that characterize this polity alone. But people are optimistic because they've seen the same case of the Dutch, and the Dutch have declined. So I really would want to, I would agree with you, but then I'd want to shift the definition of enlightenment to other things and focus on these strategies.
No, I really like this idea of strategies, this pragmatic approach to the Enlightenment. And also what I think is a great virtue of of your cast of Enlighteners is that they're anti-utopians. Because, we have pretty much seen all enlightened utopias fail wherever they were tried. Partly perhaps because they tended to be rationalistic, but also because they actually thought of future agrarian societies that could live in communities of virtue. They didn't understand an industrial society. They didn't understand how capitalism would change. And you are just at the moment where some very important people are beginning to understand that. And they're saying, but if we go this way, then this and this and this might happen. And, well, 200 years later, it doesn't seem that they were totally off.
Well, I think that it comes back to this notion of, abandoning the corruptions of the world and creating your own small state, which could be rural, it could be a utopia in the woods. And that just ceases to be an option.
It could be the Austrian Freedom Party.
But the notion of searching for that a mercantile system is going to chase your resources and it's going to chase your markets. And if you show the slightest bit of weakness in the face of such forces, they're going to smash and grab what you've got. And the example that I usually give is Tocqueville in Algeria. He hates what the French do in Algeria in the 1830s. He thinks it's dreadful. He thinks they've got no option. Either France remains a great power, having its own mercantile system. In the sense, Bonaparte came to the same conclusion with his continental system. The world is characterized by mercantile systems battling one another, where you make sure you've got markets, that you control the states whose markets you're interested in, where you're after the scarce resources that you need to maintain your trade. That's perhaps the major function of governments, is to do that, to secure, I don't know, obviously these days it's rare earth metals, and in different times it's obviously oil. I was actually reading Hayek the other day, and he made the prediction that Hitler would go into Scandinavia first, because it was the Scandinavian resources would have been needed for the war machine, and that is the initial desideratum, and it's mercantile systems in action, battling each other while presenting to their people claims that it's a wonderful free state, and how lucky you are to be a part of it.
Let's just differentiate. Mercantilism and capitalism are different insofar as mercantilism believes that you should beggar your neighbor. It's a zero-sum game. If one person becomes rich, another person becomes poor. So the world is a state of war. I mean, in capitalism, in free market theory, today we have the idea that, if the rising tide lifts all boats, and it's really good for everybody. But in the 18th century, people weren't thinking like that.
I'm not sure whether anybody ever really has believed, except utopians, that if the world is characterized by mercantile systems, you've got to work out a way of getting rid of them. And the declaration of free markets, or the proclamation that your markets are free, isn't a strategy to destroy mercantile systems. And I do think, coming back to Hayek's really interesting, because he seemed to be a, neoliberal advocate of free markets. He thinks economics as a profession is a disaster, because it's not recognized that there's a battle for civilization going on. And the battle for civilization means you have to fight nationalism and socialism together, which obviously he's seen from Vienna directly. And he has then seen it ruin his life, destroy his family, and obviously the families of his friends, many of whom are Jewish, pay the ultimate price and are wiped out. So economics for Hayek, the social sciences, the role of humanistic endeavors is to fight for civilization. And that means you have to attack the sources of fanaticism, exactly as in the 18th century. Obviously, Hayek's obsessed with the 18th century. And he thinks that the way to do it is to prevent nationalism from turning fanatic. And he obviously thinks that socialism is also a fanatic force because it creates republican churches that are dreadfully intolerant, and then all churches tend to fight one another. So you have the history of Protestantism writ large on the international sphere, and you're simply going to have a descent into chaos with global war. So I think that, there's nothing wrong with free markets, and everybody believes in free markets in certain circumstances.
I don't.
Well, I think that,
I don't think markets can be free. I think markets are meaningless without contracts that can be enforced and rest on legislation that has been made by Parliament, etc. Markets are always embedded. The idea of a free market seems just as theological as the rational human being.
Obviously, that's Hayek's view as well, and it was Keynes's view. And the interesting thing about Hayek is that he thinks that you have the best market society on the basis of Britishness. And the complete, one of the ironies of the 20th century, especially if you go through the period of the end of Enlightenment as I have, is that so many scholars think 19th century Britain is the ideal. It's the ideal of a free state. And as Hayek says in The Road to Serfdom, what goes wrong is German culture becomes dominant, and the British don't maintain their sense of liberty, and they allow German culture to become dominant, and therefore, according to Hayek, you get the 2 world wars and ultimately the Holocaust and the rise of a form of fanaticism. And the British are also to be blamed because they let it happen. He thinks of Britain as a failure, but he thinks that they got rid of the mercantile system in the 19th century, when you genuinely had empires for liberty. And that's why Hayek's obsessed with John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, but they're not covered in the End of Enlightenment book. But there's a broader story about defending civilization, and is the price of civilization mercantile systems? Is it the best we can do, free states plus mercantile systems, even though it's terrible for the people who are the victims of the mercantile system? Or is there a better alternative? And certainly the proclamation of free markets, we live in a free market, therefore all our problems are solved. It doesn't address the transition mechanism, and it's not going to get you where you want to go, because it's not a solvent to nationalism, and it's not a solvent if you call socialism fanaticism. It's not going to solve that problem either.
Richard, I feel a book about Hayek coming on, and frankly, I'd love to read it. So perhaps we have another opportunity to speak soon, or quite soon. But for the end of our conversation, I would like to play a little game with you, because let's just have an ideal dinner party and let's invite David Hume along. Let's have Adam Smith there as well. You've got every right to invite Friedrich Hayek, and let's throw in Mary Wollstonecraft. So that just won't be too boring. It won't be a boring evening, I think. But when you have David Hume looking at the world today, looking at our economic system, looking at our system of dominance, of hegemonic dominance, looking at our cultural discussions, at our culture wars, what do you think someone of his intellect and outlook would have made of that?
I think, unfortunately, he would think that the world hadn't changed much. And I think the presumption of progress, I think he'd find some of the technological developments remarkable, but they don't really have faith in projectors. They worry about the projector who promises an easy solution to problems, especially technological solutions to problems. They don't have faith in those kinds of people. There's a chance that they would have thought our politics and our economics had gone downhill and was not doing what it needed to do, which is to fight for civilization. Because obviously they believe in enlightenment. They believe it's possible. They believe in liberty. And they also believe in commerce. So, I mean, I think that they might think the world hadn't changed much, but where it had changed, we were repeating the same mistakes that were clear in their time, and that we ought to be more enlightened ourselves.
Do you think any of the things that happened in the intervening 200 years would have tainted their beliefs in liberty and rationality?
I don't think so. I mean, you know, in some ways, if there's a positive message, it's that in the 18th century, people think free states are not going to survive. You know, there's not going to be any liberty. Certainly no democracy is going to survive. The fact we live in the kinds of free state that we do, you know, they may be fanatic, they may be mercantile systems, but we live in free states, and a lot of people want to come and live in them who don't live in free states, and they think we're very lucky to live in free states. So I think they would think that was probably a very, very positive thing. But they would also say that it's clear that we've paid a price. Not that there was, you know, the alternative to them, the government of laws rather than men, is autocracies where you have systems of laws that are very stable, that which guarantee your liberty, but you don't have any genuine, you know, political liberty, as we would call it. You just have civil liberties. So they thought that was not the best thing, although it was perfectly viable in places like France. They thought it's fine to have such a state, and in other parts of Europe. So I suppose they would, but they worry about liberty becoming fanatic, and this worry about the descent into Republican churches. So, you know, 18th century language explains a lot of our world, although I'm sure they would say they needed to do a lot of work to understand what had happened in the 2 centuries after. Well,
Richard, thank you very much for talking to us about the end of the Enlightenment, such an unequivocally depressing subject, but you make it actually very entertaining. I love the biographical sketches as well. I love the way that also the development of the ideas is very strongly tethered to historical realities, economic realities, different enlightenments. But it leaves us in a very curious situation in the present, because it feels that all of this isn't all that new, as you say. Richard Whatmore, thank you very much for being my guest on the BlomCast, and I hope you'll be soon again, perhaps with some reflections on Hayek and a new kind of economic and moral order. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. It's been a real honor and a joy. Thank you very much.
And you can subscribe to this podcast. You can tell your aunts and uncles, your children and friends and lovers about this. And you can leave comments and give me tips, or perhaps have outrageous remarks or criticisms about this. I'm looking forward to all of those, and I'm looking forward to welcoming you soon again. I've got some fantastic other guests lined up. Bye-bye.